So the first thing we want to do is to recognize the challenges and some of the common obstacles that we have. And so one of the obstacles that I also ran into in my early days was misunderstanding how we really gather intuitive information to begin with. I had been introduced to the idea of intuition and psychic phenomenon, primarily my own sort of, obviously what I observed was this sort of phenomenon of clairvoyance. And so like mind, I thought that in order for me to be intuitive, to be psychic, that I needed to be able to have visions and I needed to be able to see energy and I needed to be able to see, things. And I never really was particularly one that could really see. I may get little shadowy images and sort of know that I'm seeing something, but it's rare. It's happened, but it's rare that I get like just a clear visual image as part of my intuitive process. And so at the time that I was learning how to do this, I didn't know that there were other ways to gather information. And so I judged my own intuition and my own psychic abilities based upon see stuff. And of course, I couldn't. So I spent a lot of time beating myself up and thinking that I wasn't getting it. Meanwhile, I was actually developing intuition in other ways, but I wasn't recognizing what was actually happening. And so I did eventually come across a set of teachings where I learned that there are multiple ways to actually gather intuitive information. And basically, all of our senses have the capacity to help us in our intuitive process. And so clairvoyance, of course, is the one that I named, clear vision. There's also clear sentience, which is clear feeling. And so this might be, having vibrational feelings or sensations in the body, or emotions, like the vibrational resonance of other people's emotions, for instance. Clairaudience is clear hearing, where we might be able to hear things. This can be, hearing words inside of our own head. It can be hearing, like a voice outside of ourselves that's speaking to us, or feeling like we're hearing maybe a guide speaking to us or angel speaking to us or something like that. But that we would literally in a clairaudience experience hear someone speaking to us probably as if they were speaking out loud. Like that it can be that clear, or it can be more of a process of experiencing thoughts in the head that don't seem necessarily related to your own. And then there is the final one that I discovered after in this learning process that was really my main form of intuition, which is called claircognizance. And it is basically clear knowing, clear cognition, and it's basically means that you know without knowing. That there's just sort of a spontaneous knowledge, a spontaneous idea, spontaneous, trusted knowledge that kind of arises, and that you're able to recognize that and to trust it. And so I came to recognize that that was my primary form of intuition. That clairsentience is also sort of a secondary kind that I have easy access. And so once I was able to tune into those being the primary ways that I was able to gather intuitive information, then it made my life a lot easier, because I was no longer beating myself up and wondering why I couldn't see things. I just recognized that this was, at least for now, the way that my intuitive process worked. And so I was able to kind of focus on it and really cultivate that kind of information and that kind of experience through it. It is also technically possible to develop extrasensory perceptions through the taste and the smell. Those are the three senses, or the two senses that we hadn't already mentioned. It is technically possible, yes, and I'm sure there are people who have done it. It tends to not be quite as common, or at least not quite as common out. So those are some of the ways that we have our own inner experiences of intuition. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, the idea of the grow, there are also, especially sometimes I think in the beginning of our journey, there are tools for cultivating our intuition that, have a history and a tradition that have come about over hundreds or thousands of years. So these are tools that are designed to help us tap into collective patterns, archetypes, and wisdom as a means to go beyond the thinking mind and into deeper self-awareness and reflection. So they can help us open our intuition and see beyond the limitations of the mind. And so the three most common that I'm aware of and that I've used the most, Vedic astrology is one. And of course, there are other forms of astrology, but Vedic astrology is the one that I've learned. It's the one that I teach to my students as well. Um, and I found that to be a very powerful tool of self-awareness and learning how to, more deeply understand the human condition and psychology, as well as to be able to start seeing the patterns of how events unfold, and the various strengths and weaknesses that we have, the process that we're going through in terms of like what is the actual transformational healing process leading us through our spiritual awakening. So those are some of the things that I've learned to be able to use Vedic astrology for, those and other kinds of things as well. Tarot and other oracle decks that exist out there are another way of being able to ask questions and using the cards. And of course, I know that there usually are companion books to these oracle decks that sort of give you a starting place of interpretation. But there's also a deeper connection to tarot of really letting the images and the names of the cards just trigger something innate inside of you, so that you are letting the card open into your own inner pieces of archetype, and what ideas and awarenesses does it bring about naturally for you? What's your initial impression of it? Those are the kinds of things that are actually inviting you to open into your own intuition, instead of only focusing on what's the interpretation. And of course, the interpretation gives us a starting place to help us understand the imagery and the symbolism. But ultimately, some would suggest that it doesn't matter whether you know what it means or not. What does it mean to you as you're pulling that card out within the context of the reason that you're doing it? And then there's also the I Ching or the I Ching, which is a Chinese-based system where you're throwing coins and kind of coming up with 64 different little aphorisms that you can read as part of the interpretation process. And of course, there are other systems that exist as well. And so all of these tools can help us learn to develop a trust in our own natural, innate inner guidance and wisdom if we learn how to let it reflect our own inner truth. And that becomes another part of using those tools. Is it can sometimes easily happen, especially in the beginning. And I know, like my example of the tarot, like I was looking for that card deck to give me guidance. I wanted it to tell me what was going to happen. And in a sense, it kind of was, but I wasn't open enough to actually see what it was trying to tell me, because I wasn't letting what I didn't want to perceive to actually arise into my awareness and trust it. But we can learn how to access our intuition by learning to trust those impressions and learn to trust the various things that are being triggered by those tools, so that at some point we might recognize, with or without the cards, with or without the Vedic astrology chart, that we can also tap into and experience a deeper sense of intuition by just interacting with the world around us, by just being present to what's true and arising within our own intelligence, within our own inner consciousness, within our own. And so that's why I say that they can be tools to help us cultivate our intuition. And there's also the possibility that we can continue using them. I still use Vedic astrology, especially with clients, but that we also can eventually move beyond the need for those tools as well, although they can still, of course, remain helpful. There's nothing wrong with continuing to use them either. But how can we tap into our intuition and our inner guidance in a way that it just becomes a part of our experience of self and our connection to the divine, and ultimately a connection to our own deeper true self? So they can serve to inspire us to seek out and discover the inner power of this wisdom, which is the divine content of our true self as well.